Okay, let's talk about the birth and then the early years of Jesus. We don't have a whole lot of information, but let's see what we can kind of reconstruct. So pulling up the PowerPoint for this, let's see where we get our story in the first place. So in terms of the Gospels, our story primarily derives from the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke. So looking at the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew is written to Jesus' followers in Antioch, which would be in Syria. So they're from Jewish descendants. And look at what they drop there. So in terms of like names, talks about King Herod, talks about wise men from the east, astrologers, talks about a star, King Herod again. This line should be over here. It drops the names like Bethlehem and Judah, shepherd my people of Israel, calls for the wise men, Bethlehem again. Let's see more about Herod. Oh, look at that. There's a prophecy mentioned here. It's out of Jeremiah, where it says, out of Egypt, I've called my son. Herod is mentioned again. More quotations from the Old Testament to the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing, an angel of the Lord. Again, Herod. And here mentions he will be called a Nazarene. Then in contrast, when we go to the Gospel of Luke, notice what's mentioned there. Not really Herod, but the Emperor Augustus, Quirinius, governor of Syria. You notice that we have a whole different set of leaders. It does mention descendants from the house and family of David. It mentions a registry, like a census. Talks about being a savior, which would be soter, sometimes talked about like that for the emperors. It mentions an inn, Roman inn that they had. Signs being given. The Romans were very much into signs of the God. This will be a sign for you. Simeon, God of the highest earth, peace among those whom he favors. They were waiting for the Pax Romana, but this is irene, the peace that's being favored. So what do you do with that? Well, why are different things mentioned? Let's look at Matthew 2. On the left side, we see the story that's brought to Christians that come from a Jewish background. And we notice that leaders are mentioned that we primarily find in the area of Israel and Palestine. Whereas Luke addresses the same story, but to Theophilus, who is more accustomed to leaders in the Roman Empire. So he drops names like Augustus and Quirinius. And here's where I want you to become familiar with a phrase that I really like. And I always say that God meets people where we are. I see this in the Old Testament, I see this in the New Testament, and I see it today. God meets people where they are and where we are. So if the people are Jewish Christians, then things are being dropped that make sense to Jewish Christians. And if there are people like Theophilus, kind of embedded with the interest in the Roman Empire, then those are the kind of names that are being dropped because they connect with the people. In Matthew 2, Magi are mentioned. We often translate that as wise men. It's more appropriate to just leave it Magi, people that are looking into the stars. We even have found synagogues in northern Israel and other places where you find astrology sites. That was all very much intertwined. Egypt is mentioned. Out of Egypt, I've called my son. These Old Testament kind of prophecies. The Jewish people really would connect with that, right? Whereas over on the other side, shepherds are mentioned that you would find in the surrounding area. A Roman inn where people would stop. A manger, this idea of a feeding trough. It's not a shed, it's a feeding trough for animals. And on the left side, it actually mentions that they're in a house. Actually, Matthew picks up after the birth. They're already living in a house. They've probably been there for 2 years because it takes like 2 years for these magi to show up. It mentions Herod Archelaus. So the story is really aimed at that. I think when we come to traditional Christmas stories and all, we just put it all in a pot and stir it, and we get a story. But that's not so when we look at the Gospels tell the stories in a way that meets people where they are. Oh, a little word about these magi. They came from the east, and sure enough, when you look at the east, you're looking at Babylon and Babylonia, and that's where you would get like astrologers from. So they come to Bethlehem. Bethlehem is mentioned as a city of David, ancestry, where the birth takes place, and there's a lot more for you to read in the book, right? But I wanted to show you this picture of modern day Bethlehem. I had a college friend that actually lived in Bethlehem at one point. She worked in an Arab orphanage. It was always fun because at the time I could put on a Christmas card that it had to be sent to Bethlehem. So I would address my Christmas card to Bethlehem. There was something funny about that, right? But notice all the flat roofs. That's why you know it's an Arab city. People like to live on the roof, drink the tea, say the prayers there. And then, of course, there is like a church there, Church of the Nativity. I want to take you to a different place here. This is actually in Nazareth, not in Bethlehem, but I want to show you this. There's some controversy. The book actually talks about the inn not being an inn. I'm more on the side of the people that thinks it actually was an inn. What you look at here actually isn't in. This is actually in Nazareth, so these steps are built later. But when you look at this structure here, these are actually like these limestone structures. There's a hole cut in it so that you can actually look down into it, and you can see some pillars that hold up that structure. And if we zoom in, I want you to see this. Do you see that? You see this little like part where you can kind of like hold something in there? Well, that's actually a structure underneath a building. So there would have been a building on top of it, presumably like an inn. An inn would have been like a tavern, if you will, in Roman times. And that would be the basement where you see there. That's a place where you could tie a rope with an animal, like a donkey or whatever they would travel with, and a colt. And you could keep your animals there sheltered for the night. And it makes more sense that the inn actually worked and that the inn was full upstairs, but that Joseph and Mary would have ended up downstairs where they would have been protected from the elements, and there would have been animals there naturally. It's not a shed, it's just a nice stone fracture, and where they could have stayed. It would not have been as expensive. I must also say that I'm a mom. I've given birth to children. That I always say, I would rather give birth on I-35, the interstate that runs through here where we are located here at Mary Harder-Baylor, than give birth in an inn. An inn was not necessarily a place with a good reputation. It's often a place where people would frequent that have been on the road for a long time with all the immorality problems and lack of hygiene problems. I think I would have been down in the basement too. It sounds like a place of peace. So then what about the growing up years? Well, we don't have a whole lot of information. We know that they returned, once they came back out of Egypt, they returned to Galilee. That's an upper region here. So we have a place here. This would be Galilee. This would be, Perea. So actually he would be Galilee. Up there would have been Nazareth. That's where they went back to the town. It says the child grew, became strong, and grew up there. And then the next part that we have, it skips way ahead to Jesus being 12 years old, which would be significant in Jewish tradition. And they actually take a yearly pilgrimage. It says that they did that. They went to the festival of Passover. It commemorates a Jewish story of God leading people out of a predicament from Egypt. Very interesting that Egypt comes back up again. And the story there is that they take Jesus, this 12-year-old boy, with them, and then on the way back, they kind of lose track of him. It's like several days, and mom thinks he's with dad, and dad thinks he's with mom. And we're thinking, like, how can this be? Well, they traveled the caravans. There were sections with the male, sections with the females. And the underlying theme might be, whether or not Jesus was considered a full-fledged male here at this point, or was still with the children. When they go back to Jerusalem, they find him actually among the teachers. And then Jesus says, verse 49, why were y'all searching for me? Did you not know I must be in my Father's house? And so you kind of see this development of Jesus coming of age. And then the commentator here says, and Jesus, verse 52, increased in wisdom, in years, and in divine measure. So interesting. Years later, when Jesus has already started what we call his ministry years, his traveling years, there's an account of him returning to Nazareth. So he must have been away. He goes to the synagogue. It says it was his custom. So he must have been raised in the synagogue tradition, and he stood up to read. This is a little miniature layout of what the houses would have looked like. There would have been simple houses. The book describes it, single roof structures. So that's what it would have liked. This is a modern day picture of Nazareth. It's the largest Arab town at this point. You can buy some postcards. So large structures. It's Arab, so it's Muslim. And but when they go in there, they're really not welcomed with open arms. They're kind of scoffing. Is this not the carpenter? And actually, the Greek term here for which that's translated is ha tekton. It's more like an artisan. So we tend to equate carpentry with woodworking, but ha tekton would be more like an artisan, like somebody who works both with wood and maybe as a mason, and recognizes that he's the son of Mary, brother of James, Joseph, and Judas, and Simon. And they mention also that that Jesus has sisters, but not by name. That's explained by the fact that it's a patriarchal society. There's no Joseph mentioned here. And so, a couple of reasons that this passage is interesting. It mentions they took offense at him. So, for one, at this point, there's no Mary veneration in the church. If you grew up Catholic, I know later on we get a deep appreciation for the person of Mary. That's not at this point yet. And so Son of Mary, that may be the reverse, right? I think even if Joseph at this point has passed away, you would still be known as the son of, and then the male line. So the fact that he's identified here as Son of Mary could very well be this idea of we're not buying the story. We're not buying the story that you say, the Holy Ghost came over you and you were a child. And so notice that the siblings are indicted here as well. They're standing there while they're being called out. So that's quite something. And Jesus says, well, prophets, they're not without honor, except in their own town, among their own kin and their own house. These people just don't want them. And by the way, if you were raised as a Catholic, or you are a practicing Catholic, this may come on as a little bit weird, right? This idea of Jesus having brothers and sisters in the Catholic faith for everyone. Mary remains a perpetual virgin. In fact, that's a official day of commemoration. The idea that even Mary, in order to be a clean vessel, was born of a virgin. And so that's just a difference between Catholic and Protestant faith. So in the Catholic faith, it's often believed that these were either cousins of Jesus, or that these were subsequent children of Joseph. In Protestantism, we believe that Mary and Joseph had subsequent children. So since we kind of follow the Protestant tradition here, we're a Baptist school, that's what we follow here. But by all means, you're welcome to hold on to your tradition there. But that explains it, right? So yeah, not welcome because they just don't believe the story there. So a couple of scenes here. Of course, these are reenactments, but I like the fact that it shows a possible workshop scenario here with some old implements there. And these are just some Westerners that give it out there. Some tools that would have been used for masonry. And the reason this is interesting is if you remember, Nazareth and Sepphoris are real close to one another. That's kind of Roman pagan city that would have been there. And it's possible that they did a lot of carpentry and masonry work there. In fact, I'm standing here in Sepphoris taking a picture of Nazareth kind of on that hillside. And you can see how close that is. You can pull a cart there. It's also kind of hilly, nothing grows there. At one point, somebody even says, what good can come from Nazareth? This is not your prime real estate. I mean, you can make a good living there, but it's not like it's somewhere where irrigation is easily done. So this is once again a picture from inside Sepphoris. You can kind of see the Roman columns and the street, and just imagine Jesus and Joseph and the brothers just rolling through there, and you can even see the carts carving out a path in the roads. And so, once again, we have names of siblings that might have been part of the trade workers there.